C.S. Lewis was born and raised in Belfast, Northern Ireland. But from the age of 9 onward, he lived for 8 months of each year as a boarding school student in England. He visited Oxford for the first time a week after his 18th birthday. Lewis had come here to take, or as he would say, to sit for, the university scholarship exam. The year was 1916, and the rigorous exam lasted 5 days. He wrote to his father after the second day of testing.
I don't know exactly how I'm doing, but this place has surpassed my wildest dreams. I never saw anything so beautiful, especially on these frosty moonlit nights. Though in the hall of Oriel, where we do our papers, it is fearfully cold. We have, most of us, tried with varying success to write in our gloves.
After each day's tests, Jack strolled along the streets of Oxford, filled with the hope that he might be chosen to become an Oxford student. It also seemed like a vain hope that he might one day become a member of the Oxford faculty. As Lewis saw Oxford's celebrated colleges and other famous landmarks, he certainly would have walked past this great church, the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, here on High Street. Maybe he stopped in to look around, if only for the sake of its extraordinary history. Lewis was a committed atheist then. He certainly could not have foreseen that 25 years later, he would actually preach a sermon here. It was called The Weight of Glory, and it would eventually be listed as one of the truly great sermons of all time. The Weight of Glory was written during the incredible carnage of World War II, as lives were being lost by the thousands. In contrast to many of his fellow academics who saw man not as having been created in the image of God, but merely the result of evolutionary chance, Lewis preached from this pulpit about the priceless nature of each individual.
It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. Remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as is the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors.
There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It's an amazing thought. Lewis believed an incredible eternal destiny awaits each of us. In this session, we'll look at the Christian virtue of hope, our continual looking forward to the eternal world, which Lewis argued was not a form of escapism nor wishful thinking, but a Christian virtue, one of the things a Christian is meant to do.
In an earlier session, I gave a summary of the Christian story in 3 short sentences. The world is good, the world is broken, and the world will be restored. Now the time has come to talk about that last part, when God restores the world. If we're grieved by the state of this planet with its wars, its catastrophes, its multiplied suffering, God grieves far more and promises to do something about it. I must say, grasping this point was crucial to my own return to faith. I was raised in a church that talked a lot about heaven and even more about hell. In fact, looking around, it seemed to me as a child that the whole purpose of life was to grit your teeth and get through it so that you could cross over and reach Beulah land, wherever that was. Much later, a pastor told me that our attitude toward heaven and the next life depends on the circumstances of our lives here on earth. When he pastored a church full of poor people, they liked to sing, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." Later, he moved to a wealthy suburban church where they sang hymns like, "This is my Father's world." Thinking about that contrast, I realized we actually have a foot in both worlds. This is our Father's world, but it's broken, it's fallen, and it's not our permanent home, at least not in its present condition. Heaven looks appealing if your lot on earth is misery. Think of the well-known spiritual sung by slaves and still sung today. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. If your life consists of picking cotton, getting beaten, having your children sold out from under you, that whole miserable slave existence, why, the afterlife may be the only hope you've got. For many slaves it was. They couldn't wait to cross over to the next world. Remember, C.S. Lewis first gave these talks during the darkest days of World War II, when German bombers flew daily over his nation to spread death and destruction, a time when England desperately needed hope. Things have changed. For most people who live in the prosperous West, life is rather comfortable now. We live twice as long as people did 100 years ago. We have heated homes and indoor plumbing, and science has conquered many diseases. Heaven? Skeptics dismiss such talk as pie in the sky by and by. It's like a drug, they say, an opiate of the people to keep the lower classes from becoming too restless. C.S. Lewis had a different approach, one that neatly brought those two worlds together. You see, Lewis was drawn to faith not by scary sermons about hellfire and brimstone, but through the deep longings he felt inside. Yes, the world is good. He sensed that in so many ways, but it's not good enough. He felt a persistent longing for something more. Think of the longings you had the first time you fell in love, or your first trip to a foreign country, or the first time you tasted what would become your favorite food. Somehow nothing quite measures up. Our deepest longings awaken with a start, yet they never fully satisfy. Lewis masterfully presents both worlds, the world of grass and rocks and sky, and yes, chairs and tables, and the world of matter that we live in, and also a hidden supernatural world. He brought those two worlds together in works of the imagination, such as his 3 books of space fiction and the famous Narnia series. Here in Mere Christianity, Lewis once again brings the two worlds together. He points to the good things we experience as a mere echo or copy of the real world that we cannot see. Our pleasures are drippings of grace, he once said. They whet our appetite for what lies ahead. As a young person, I rebelled against the notion that we should just grit our teeth and wait for heaven. I was experiencing the goodness of the world in so many ways, the beauties of nature, music, romantic love. Previously, I had this picture of God as a cosmic policeman just looking for someone who might be having a good time so he could squash that person. No, I learned God was an artist who lavished the world with beauty wherever I looked. A carpet of wildflowers in the remote wilderness, gorgeous tropical reefs in the ocean. As G.K. Chesterton once put it, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a deep sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. I felt that gratitude, and I wanted to know the God who created this world. Heaven is not some place in the sky that we'll be whisked off to someday. Rather, this earth will be restored. There's a continuity between the two worlds, and the best of what we experience here will finally be fulfilled in the next life. Once a young girl wrote C.S. Lewis and asked, "Will there be chocolate in heaven?" His reply, "If you desire it in heaven, it will be there." The images of heaven that the Bible paints are exactly that. They're images. Writers turn to the most precious objects they encountered on earth: gold, precious stones. Why, in heaven they'll be used to pave the streets, to decorate the city gates. At last, the world will work as God originally intended. One reason C.S. Lewis is so persuasive is that he usually considered the alternatives. He knew that not everyone would agree with him. Although all of us have desires, not everyone sees them as God's gifts, as hints of a greater future. So in this chapter, Lewis examines three alternatives. The first one he calls the fool's way. It describes people who spend their lives chasing pleasures. They dash from one lover to the next, from one pleasure to the next. Oddly enough, it's rich and successful people who can most afford to indulge in pleasures who end up being the most bored and dissatisfied. Again and again they crash or they overdose on drugs or alcohol. Think of Robin Williams, Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, Amy Winehouse, Tiger Woods, NFL football stars. Watching famous people in our celebrity culture, we should have learned by now that desires can let you down. They don't ultimately satisfy. Keep chasing them, and eventually you'll be their slave. That's what addictions are all about. Sex, food, alcohol, drugs. If used wrongly, they become our masters. Next, Lewis mentions the way of the disillusioned or sensible man. These are often good citizens. They get up every day, check email, go to work, eat dinner, watch TV, go to bed. The next day they do the same. It's a drab, gray routine. Every once in a while, though, the thought occurs, is that all there is? Shouldn't there be something more to life? In some ways, the disillusioned are better off than the fool. They're more realistic. But oh, what they're missing out on. As Lewis says, supposing infinite happiness really is there, waiting for us. Finally, Lewis presents the Christian way. And here is where he most directly brings the two worlds together. He writes, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. On earth, God has built into us desires for good things, for sex, food, beauty, meaning, achievement, adventure, love. We don't have to go around with long faces like ascetics trying to avoid pleasure. After all, Jesus himself was criticized for hanging out with the wrong crowd, for feasting instead of fasting. It's okay to enjoy God's gifts. That's what they're there for. On the other hand, earthly pleasures don't ultimately satisfy. They'll always let you down because they're a copy, an echo of another world. And we should also live with that other world in mind." C.S. Lewis spelled this out in one of his best sermons, The Weight of Glory. He said, "Our pleasures are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." And in the same sermon, we are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. So in a sense, we're like amphibians with one foot in this world and one foot in the next. And that leads me to one of my favorite parts of C.S. Lewis's writings, where he takes on those who dismiss Christians for emphasizing pie in the sky, by and by. If you read history, he says, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. He mentions the apostles who changed the brutal Roman Empire and the evangelicals in England who abolished the slave trade. They left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were centered on heaven. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. I have to tell you, as a journalist, I've seen that truth lived out over and over. I think of Dr. Paul Brand, a brilliant orthopedic surgeon who devoted his life to some of the most neglected people on the planet, Dalits or untouchables in India who have leprosy. Or Millard Fuller, a young millionaire whose life was a mess until he gave away his money and began Habitat for Humanity to build houses for those who had none. Or Dame Cicely Saunders, who gave up a medical practice to start the modern hospice movement because she didn't like the way hospitals were treating dying patients. Each one of those pioneers was living for an audience of one, seeking to please God. In the process, they managed to change the world. And that's what Christians are called to do. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus taught us to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We who have a foot in both worlds are called to demonstrate a different way to live. The way to live the most fulfilled life is not the route of selfishness, ambition, competition, and indulgence. It's living how God intended. If we do that, we benefit, and so does the world around us.
Just a short walk from the kilns, Shotover Hill provides one of the best views in all of Oxford, and it was a favorite stop for Lewis when he went out for a stroll through the woods that surround the house. While he claimed that he did not have the head for climbing mountains or sharp precipices, he always preferred walks that went over the hills to ones that stayed down in the valleys. In his autobiography, Lewis reports that as young boys, he and Warnie used to gaze out from their bedroom window at what they called the Green Hills. They were not very far off, he writes, but they were to children quite unattainable. They taught me longing. In The Weight of Glory, Lewis describes this desire for a far-off country, which he said haunts our dreams. This desire, this longing, may come to us through books or certain landscapes, or even through favorite hobbies, but they are only the vehicles through which this longing comes. The longing itself is something we're born with. As we learned earlier, Lewis calls this longing joy with a capital J, and it is a desire that cannot be satisfied in this life. Joy, for Lewis, was the center of his life story, and it's clear in his writings that Lewis believes that all of us have the same longing. Lewis eventually came to recognize this strange but wonderful longing as a longing for heaven, our true home. Once he was a Christian, Lewis explored this idea in many of his writings, including the beautiful moment at the end of the last battle when Jewel the Unicorn reaches the new Narnia and proclaims, "I have come home at last. This is my real country. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now." In this session, we looked at the Christian virtue of hope, our desire for that far-off country. In the next session, we'll turn to Book 4 from Mere Christianity and look at the God in three persons who is the true object of our desire.